in theory lecture of the new year. It is the year 2022, which, as many people on the internet have already pointed out, is in fact 2022.
Yes.
It is the sequel. And I am joined to my left by Jeneline.
Good morning.
Who definitely does not have a birthday today. And it is cold, as you can probably see in the car. So we're very happy that you're joining us this morning. If you're joining us for the very first time, welcome to our learning community. This is a weekly session where we talk you through some of the key concepts within philosophy and theory. At the moment, we're talking a lot about Kant and Hegel and Lacan and whatever. I tend to riff. I tend to teach. Jeneline accompanies me on this riff, on this journey, this adventure that we have together.
I try and sidetrack Julian.
Which is always very fruitful sidetracks. And we have a student joining us from Utrecht, where I went to university, actually, at the UU in Utrecht, as well as Indonesia. So please, if you're joining us, do leave us a comment telling us where you're joining us from. That always makes us very happy. And of course, also a very big thank you to our patrons who have kept this project alive into the new year and who continue to support us financially so that we can keep teaching these classes for as long as we can. So the first class of 2022, if you are joining for the first time, if you want to make this the year in which you dedicate yourself to our classes, hello and welcome. You can find all of our content on Patreon, or you can join the live stream for free here on Instagram. We see students from Indonesia, Netherlands, Poland, Jordan, Colombia, and Florida.
Nice. Miami.
Iran. That's fantastic. That's absolutely amazing. We're genuinely blessed to have students from around the world. Moscow. So thank you for leaving those comments. Someone from London, where we used to live.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just going to launch right in.
Yeah.
We're going to start easy, and then we're going to make it more complex. As always, you can, of course, also download these classes as a podcast exclusively on Patreon. Plus, my book, The Hermeneutic Temptation, is an introduction to Zizek, Hegel, Marx, and Lacan, which is available until the end of January. And so if you buy it until January, you can read it or listen to it as an audiobook. After January, it disappears forever into the digital ether. And so those of you who have downloaded the book will be the only people who own that book forever.
And it's not like an ebook on your Kindle, which I recently learned. You don't actually own the ebook. You're just renting it.
Yeah.
And Amazon can decide to delete it at any time. We're not going to delete it.
No, we don't like Amazon. we don't use Amazon.
Once you have it, it's yours.
Yes, that's right. Once you have my book, The Hermeneutic Temptation, it is yours forever, and we will delete it at the end of January, at which point it will no longer be available. A lot of you have asked me why, and I have responded with what Lacan would deem the essence of ideology, with the answer, because. In fact, if you want to think about the history of philosophy, the history and the very purpose of philosophy emerges with not just the question why, but with the word why because. What I mean by that is, as soon as you posit that something is, it simply is, because you're not questioning the conditions of possibility. And philosophy is nothing other than the questioning of the conditions of possibility for everything you experience in the world. For example, why do you put your cutlery in the kitchen drawer? That is a philosophical question par excellence. Okay. Thank you for those of you who are telling me to shut up and take your money. If you'd like to give me your money, although I probably won't shut up, go to www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian, or click the link in our bio. Okay, so I want to start with something that you and I did yesterday.
Yes, please.
Yesterday, Jeneline and I went to a spa.
Yes.
In which they have something which is called like a flotation tank, a flotation device. And if you want to imagine what it looks like, I'll post a video to Instagram later. It looks like something out of Blade Runner, or...
You're going to say, if Apple designed a coffin...
Yeah, that's great. That's the best
filled
description.
it with 12 inches, like a foot of water.
Yeah, salty water.
Salty, very, very salty water.
If Apple designed a coffin, that's so good. That's so great. You know, probably
what it's like.
At some point Apple will provide like birth to life to death support. Anyway, yes. So yeah, I mean that's the
It
best
has
description.
speakers. It has lights.
It looks like a giant pod,
Yes.
and it's a flotation tank. And the idea is that you go into this flotation tank for between an hour and 90 minutes, and you have a form of sensatory deprivation. You are in the dark, and you just lie there. Now, one of the things that I should say before we talk about this is that my relationship with anything wellness related is a little bit like if you try to have sex with a really beautiful person, but you just don't want them to open their mouth. I know that sounds incredibly crass, but it's like everything is perfect until they say something like, I don't know, you know? And that's sort of how my relationship is with everything wellness. Like, I'm sort of committed. I know I'm going to enjoy the experience.
Until you read the brochure, and
Until-
then you're completely turned off by it.
In this case, it's the messages they send you on your phone. And the message that I got was, are you ready for your personal utopia? And the quote-unquote philosophy professor in me immediately wants to point out that the idea of a personal utopia is like contradiction in terms.
Yes.
In fact, it immediately highlights to me one of the problems of wellness as a culture, which is that it promises you the idea of individual transcendence, which is detached from, as it were, the benefit of the common good.
Well, it's predicated on the notion that you can shut out the rest of the world.
Yeah. And so yesterday, Jenlene and I experienced our own personal utopia. Of course, there is such a thing as a personal utopia, except we'd put it in psychoanalytic terms. A personal utopia is a moment in which you are momentarily released from the captivity of yourself. In other words, it's a form of desubjectivization. And this can take on one of two forms. In the classic Freudian model, we have what is known as the death drive. And the death drive is when you cease to experience yourself because you are in the process of something that transcends your own being. For example, Jenlene and I recently watched the movie Free Solo, directed by Jimmy Chin, with Alex Honnold, the free climber, in the movie. Although technically, for those of you who watching who climb, all climbers are free climbers. It's only people who climb without ropes by themselves who are free soloists. Doesn't matter.
Nice distinction there.
Now, the movie Free Solo depicts the ascent, the attempt by Alex Honnold to climb up El Capitan in California, in Yosemite, without any ropes. In other words, the idea is that he's supposed to scale this mountain without any kind of security device. If he slips, if he makes a mistake, if he takes too long of a break, if literally anything happens, he falls to his death. There is a black and white disparity between survival and
success and failure.
Success and failure. Thank you. Yeah, that's a better way to put it. And one of the things that I thought was interesting about that, which you may have thought about too, is the relationship of the free solo climber to others. In fact, in this case, to the cameramen. And one of the things that exists within solo climbing is, and it's more than just a principle, is the idea that you should experience it by yourself. In fact, that one of the most dangerous things a solo climber can do is to climb alone with someone else, or to be observed by someone else. Is that something that came across?
Yeah, no, it totally resonates. Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of, I think, free soloists have, part of the challenge in filming them, and this is true for other climbers, is that having a cameraman around changes the dynamic. And one of the things that I think that made Free Solo such an interesting film is I think that Jimmy Chin is really sensitive to that dynamic of what does it mean for the climber to be a performer in a sense, but doing it for themselves. And Alex Honnold really answers that question of like, why do you climb the mountain? I think he literally says, because it's there.
Right.
Like, and that gets back to what you were talking about earlier. It's like, that is sort of the philosophical question of why do something? Because it's there, because it's...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and moreover, the relationship of the climber to the mountain is another version of the very famous Freudian expression, wo es war, soll ich werden, which means where it was, I will become. Now, traditionally within psychoanalysis, the idea is that the it, in this case, is your unconscious. And it's through the mediation and repression of the unconscious that the idea of the ego emerges, which is also why the ego for Lacan is imaginary. We'll get to that later. Of course, when it comes to climbing, you've transposed that idea of the it. I don't mean the id, I mean the it, onto the mountain. Where the mountain is, my own subjectivity will emerge. I feel most alive when I'm part of the mountain. I feel most alive when I'm at the exact sort of this liminal distance between life and death, that threshold between the void and my finite existence. Now, the reason that it's problematic to have a camera crew there, or even to have other people watching you, isn't strictly speaking out of principle. It's not just saying, oh, this experience belongs to me and I don't want to share it, even if that may be true. What happens instead is that as soon as a camera is present, it means that the other is present. The whole point of a free solo climb is a radical de-othering. It is taking subjective experience to its most raw form, where it is you and the mountain and life and death. As soon as you introduce an other, it becomes a performance. It becomes a performative act. Now, the stakes of your performance lie within the experience of the other. What happens, in other words, is that as soon as you introduce a cameraman or even a spectator to a free solo climb, you've gone from the unconscious on the level of the imaginary, which is me and the mountain, towards what Lacan would later call the subject. And the subject always exists on the level of the symbolic order. In other words, we have here a distinction between the subject on the level of the imaginary, in the void between life and death, and the subject is mediated by the other. And the two can't, strictly speaking, coexist. Mm-hmm. Now, when you climb the mountain, knowing that people are watching you, you are performing the act of climbing the mountain for other people. Now, you don't have to climb a mountain or risk your life to be aware of what this feels like. Literally, as soon as you step out the door, your very existence becomes a performative spectacle for the gaze of the other. And so what you experience as subjectivity, in some sense, is how you anticipate being received and misinterpreted through the experience of the other, which then further constitutes your own being. I probably pointed this out before, but it's also why Sartre famously has it said that hell is other people. It's not that other people make you feel bad. It's that you only experience yourself through the process of comparison to others. And that comparison gives you a sense of yourself. Mm-hmm. Also, again, why in psychoanalytic terms, the ego is in the level of the imaginary. Mm-hmm. I posit the ego as a supposedly neutral substance or an ideal ego that I would like to be, which emerges only retroactively through the perceived loss of self in comparison with the other. In other words, the symbolic order of the encounter with the other comes first. And the ego is posited retroactively as an ideal which could escape from the symbolic order. In other words, if other is hell, ego is heaven. And it's that kind of heaven that you find when you're scaling the mountain. Of course, the paradox is that to achieve that kind of blissful momentary ego of you and the mountain is itself an illusion, is itself artificial. It has to be. It's not natural. In fact, it's in many ways the least natural thing possible. It's going beyond your own survival instincts. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're doing a lot, but we haven't actually talked about the flotation tank.
Mm. Well, my question was, I wonder if after Alex Honnold did his free solo ascent of El Capitan, that he decided to do it again for himself without cameras.
I think for a lot of climbers, it's the other way around. They do it first without cameras and then on camera.
See, that's what I imagined, but we don't know. Anyway, sorry.
No, not at all. No, I mean, it's an interesting question. I'm sure someone will know the exact answer. I presume the answer is yes. Mm-hmm. For example, me and Jeneline, as soon as the cameras are off, we never exchange a philosophical thought ever again. That's such a purely
Philosophy ends at 10 o'clock.
purely performative. I mean, Marx, in a passage on ideology, writes that, I forget what it is. He says, this is where I'm riffing. Marx says that philosophy is to life as masturbation is to sex. But it's beautifully ambiguous because, A, you don't need another for masturbation. You just need the idea of the other. And secondly, it's not entirely clear if sex or masturbation is preferable, like which one is preferable to the other. And so he says that philosophy is like masturbation, apropos, and real life, apropos sex. Anyway, that aside, I wanted to talk about this flotation tank thing, which you did for the first time, and I did for the second time. And for me, the second time around was more interesting, because the first time, I was plagued by another. And the other that I was plagued by was the other of, am I doing this right? In other words, the first time I went into the flotation tank, I didn't know what to expect. And so I was worried that somehow I was doing it wrong, which is a very frustrating experience. In a very Hegelian sense, everything has to be done twice, in the same way that the floating tank has to be done twice. To properly desubjectivize in the tank, you have to let go of the idea that there is a proper way to float in the tank. And so I spent a very pleasant 1 hour floating by myself in the dark, without music, in salt water, essentially. And I have a couple of thoughts on this, but first I wanted to know what your thoughts were, if you had any. Or maybe the point is not to have any.
No, I mean, at a superficial level, I think I enjoyed it much more than I expected. I mean, I thought it was, I mean, we'd talked about desubjectivization quite a bit beforehand. So that really made a lot of sense. I know what you mean about, like, am I doing this right or wrong? And that thought always occurs to me, actually, when I'm at the dentist. Because I feel like I'm lying there and my mouth is open and I'm like, am I doing this right? Am I like, this seems very uncomfortable for the dentist or the, hygienist. How can I make this more comfortable? How can I make this better? And of course, the way I can make this better is to brush my teeth regularly and floss regularly and follow all the suggestions of the dentist. But of course, that's not what I do. It's in the moment when it's sort of being reflected back at me that I think about, that I'm evaluating whether or not I'm doing it right or wrong. And so I didn't have that anxiety about whether I was doing the right thing or not in the tank.
I finally discovered that when you go to the dentist, the best way to enjoy the dentist is to put yourself in the position of the confessor, who then has a masochistic enjoyment of their own ritual torture afterwards. Which is, I go into the dentist saying, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. I've eaten sugar. I've not brushed my teeth properly." And then I feel like I've properly deserved the punishment that's coming, and I can enjoy being the subject of said punishment. Now, one time I had laughing gas, which is a gas that they administer to you to reduce the pain, when I had my wisdom tooth removed. However, the funny thing about laughing gas, funny in like the pure sense of the form, isn't that it makes things funny. It's that you become indifferent to your pain. And so that itself becomes comedic. In other words, as soon as you take the laughing gas, what happens is that your anxiety, which in a sense is an investment that you've made towards the situation, you feel overly identify with it. As soon as you take the laughing gas, you essentially, like, you shrug. Nothing, it doesn't matter anymore. And the very fact that being in the dentist chair and not giving a crap, that becomes funny. And so it's an absurdist kind of nihilist humor that emerges. And what's really interesting about that is that you don't necessarily stop experiencing the pain. You become radically indifferent to it. And that indifference is, of course, a form of desubjectivization. You now no longer think that your subjective experience registers as a high-stake event. It's also why, like, it's funny to watch the pain of others, right? Every other person's tragedy is potentially comedy, which isn't to say that I think it's funny that people are stuck in refugee camps, all the horrors of the world, etc. But if some, like, for example, if Jeneline suddenly, like, slips, is comic to me. If you want to make a baby laugh, the best way to make a baby laugh is to start, like, hitting yourself on the head. Like, it's just, like, this human instinct. What laughing gas achieves is that it turns your own personal tragedy, being at the dentist, into a comedy of indifference.
Or you become like a spectator in a sense to your own. And I think that's fundamentally the difference between the desubjectivization of, say, laughing gas or sensory deprivation compared to, say, free solo. Is free solo, you're not a spectator to your own experience.
Right.
Whereas with laughing gas, you are, I suppose.
Yes. True.
Yeah, I really thought about that difference.
So the thing about the floating tank that I want to point out here, so floating in this meditative tank, it presents a distinct paradox, which is that it promises you an encounter with yourself. It promises you an hour of undisturbed experience of selfhood. And at the same time, it promises you an escape from self. And those two things don't work entirely. In other words, if you go into the float tank thinking that you will be released from the bounds of your own selfhood, that you will sort of float into the ether, you're likely to be disappointed. Instead, what it does is that for an hour, it radically confronts you with the cage of your own subjectivity. In other words, you are formally detached from the symbolic, from the other. There is no world, there's no other, there's no expectation. Perhaps the only big other is the clock that counts down an hour.
There was something very interesting, and I'm assuming that it was true in your room as well as mine. The room, it's pretty big, and it has this big pod, and it has a shower, and it has a sink, and it's fairly sizable. And the one thing that it does not have
There's a mirror.
is a mirror. Exactly. And I
Like I
thought
was
that
saying.
that was a really, really interesting. I think that was very intentional because the whole point is you are confronting yourself in a completely different way.
That's a super good observation. Yeah, it is a mirrorless room, which is unusual.
Yeah.
So there's no other. There's not even the other of you. And of course, when you're lying in the tank, you don't see yourself, you don't really feel yourself, you don't hear yourself. There's sensory deprivation to a degree. The paradox is that this confronts you with the only remaining thing, which is yourself and your own mind. And so the only thing that you have left to ponder, to feed upon, is you. And it becomes a weirdly like tautological, cannibalistic experience where there is nothing for the mind to do except to contemplate thought itself. Unless you're cheating and like you're listening to music or something.
I cheated.
This is also the opposite, of course, of the death drive. Remember, the death drive is, I'm so immersed in the experience of it, like the mountain, or sex, or having children, or art, that I lose a sense of my own self. It fades away. Now, if I have to choose, that is more pleasurable. I actually find the floating tank is often described to people as a challenge. And that's exactly what it is. It's a challenge of focusing more on yourself than should be bearable. In other words, it's a distinctly neurotic experience. Suddenly your breath takes on meaning. Suddenly your heartbeat takes on meaning. Your mind, which can never be at rest, starts latching onto the remnants of what were yourself and your selfhood. In other words, it's a mind that has been barred from the other, but remains barred within itself. This is, in a sense, also how therapy works. Therapy is supposed to be not the exchange of ideas, not, oh, someone is finally listening to me. Therapy, in the Lacanian sense, is supposed to be an end or an interruption of meaning. In the signifying chain, that is your expression and misinterpretation by others, in the othering, the analyst is the one person who says, I don't care. I'm not invested in your drama. I'm not the person who's here to respond to you. The analyst is the end point of that signifying chain. In the same way that when you go into a flotation tank, the flotation tank doesn't care about your pain. It doesn't care about your drama, in a sense.
And it's
just
not
left there.
judging what you're doing, how you're doing it. Yeah.
And so the difference, of course, between a therapy session and like free soloing a mountain has to do with the idea of transference. Transference within the Lacanian Freudian sense is that you impose your own desire onto the analyst. For example, climbers routinely talk about the mountain as if the mountain were a person. oh, the mountain has been there forever, and it's like a sign of the existence of man, and I become the mountain, and the mountain becomes me. Like, it's a classic, like, relationship of transference, which also exists for the philosopher and the student. If you go back to Socrates in the dialogues on love, it's specifically the idea that what makes Socrates a philosopher is that other people think that there is something in Socrates that they don't have. And Socrates knows that the very thing that they don't have is barred to him, which is the master. We can get back to that in a moment. Whereas, of course, what an analyst does and a psychoanalyst does is that an analyst doesn't assume that position. An analyst is the person who will never say, yes, I am the fountain of wisdom. The analyst should be the opposite of that. It's also why the sign of a bad teacher is a teacher who says, I have X amount of wisdom and X amount of experience that I will now transfer to you. I have this wealth of knowledge that I will now give to you. Now, why is that a sign of a bad teacher? Because that's a big thing to say. In order to understand that, you have to understand the relationship between the Stoics and early Western metaphysics. The idea of the philosopher for the early philosophers, like Socratic, Platonic, was a detachment that was the opposite of indifference. Here's what I mean by that. Indifference is you don't care about what's happening in the world. Detachment is I am not subject to what is happening in the world. In other words, the philosopher was supposed to be the detached subject who was the least indifferent subject. I care more about what's happening in the world. I care more about life. I care more about death. I care more about you than you yourself. And I do this because I am detached from you. This is also like the communist hypothesis within philosophy itself. The idea that the ultimate way to engage with the universal core of human experience is to be the person who resists the order, the logic, the here's why you are doing things. In other words, the philosopher who questions the conditions of possibility itself. What happens with the Stoics is that this detachment is repackaged and resold as a form of indifference. Here's how you too could use your detachment to gain an advantage over others in life. Here's how you could practice indifference or detachment in order to live a better, more meaningful life. In other words, the Stoics take the transcendental principle of Western metaphysics and turn it into a form of wellness, essentially, which can make you feel well, which is not a bad thing, but it is not the same as the idea of Western metaphysics, where the philosopher is supposed to be the person who embodies the paradox between the most detached person and yet the least indifferent person. Of course, it's easy to critique this by saying, well, in the academia and the ivory tower, we have this idea of the couch intellectual who supposedly cares about everybody, but makes hysterical demands towards the system that will never be met. Vice versa, you could also say that the bane of this idea exists precisely within the Platonic framework, which is the idea of the Philosopher King, the supposed pure philosophical subject that has the power to liberate others, etc. Again, this is why it's important to insert a kind of communist hypothesis within the Platonic edifice, which is to say that it is the person who is detached from the governing logic that releases the others. Of course, the seminal version of that is precisely in the Christian crucifixion. Christ doesn't succeed or win at being Christ or being the Son of God. Christ isn't the person who comes to earth and says, now I have magic powers to absolve everybody of their sins. Instead, Christ's radical failure to be the person who, according to the governing logic of the world, to be the Savior, that is what makes him the Savior. Christ, in that purely philosophical, metaphysical sense, is the most detached but least indifferent subject. And the subject, through his very, let's call it different detachment, becomes the one who absolves everyone else, who releases them. I want to talk with you about that. Jillian and I also, I watched the last 10 minutes of the movie, what is it called? Free something? Free Guy?
I think so.
Yeah, so we'll talk about that for a moment. But what were you saying?
Yeah, no, I think it's I think the distinction that you make between, let's say, training and education
Right.
is really significant. And I think that it's helpful to sort of trace that dynamic back to Socrates and the Stoics. And I was sort of imagining, like, if you know how to ride a bicycle, that doesn't necessarily help you teach someone else how to ride a bicycle. And you could go to the best, cyclists in the world, and it's not like they're going to be a better teacher of how to ride a bicycle. You learn to ride a bicycle by falling from a bicycle, essentially. And that's not to say that you can't learn things from other people who do them well. I think what you're pushing back against is this notion that there are secrets which will put you above others in this sort of competitive, perpetually finding an edge race, rather than an exploration of the self.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. I mean, there's lots to be said about it, obviously, and I'm simplifying. A good straw man for me is, for example, what the company Masterclass is doing. So, for example, Pharrell Williams, the producer and pop star Pharrell Williams, is now teaching a masterclass on empathy. And from what I've gathered by seeing promotional materials and from reading about it, to learn empathy from Pharrell Williams mostly means to hear him talk about his own success and how his own success makes him someone who is capable of empathy. And so we're back at this thing where we have this slightly aspirational model of education where we're watching a successful, attractive person talk about their own success and attractiveness and why that makes them more capable of empathy.
Yeah.
Now, of course, in a weird way, you could imagine like a
No,
butchered version.
No, I gotta say,
but my argument.
Yeah,
I need to finish my
yeah,
argument.
sorry.
A butchered version of Socrates saying, "Well, I am so wise and I'm so detached, hence I am so caring for others." That's not where you want to end up. What were you going to say?
I was gonna say, like, the cynical version for me is like the former head of Boeing saying, "I'm gonna teach a masterclass on how to absolutely ruin a company's credibility and still walk away with an enormous paycheck." Like, that's the masterclass. But
You're the cynic.
So
yeah.
cynical.
Jenlyn's a
Sorry.
cynic, and I'm not a cynic, but that's okay. That's probably makes you. I like that about you. Yeah, I suppose. I'm glad you got that off your chest.
Thank you. It's out of my system. All right.
I mean, what I'm trying to posit here is, I mean, you mentioned this idea between training and learning, etc.
Yeah.
So Hegel has this idea which he calls the cunning of reason. And for Hegel, the cunning of reason is that the way in which history moves forward is that we all think that we're our own individual agents of progress, and yet through our own petty achievements, the entire wheel of history moves forward, which isn't deterministic. It's not saying that no matter what you do, history is going to follow a preconceived trajectory. It's quite the opposite. It's saying that history has no preconceived trajectory other than your misperception as to how your actions contribute to said history. And of course, again, why history can only be experienced in hindsight. So I realize we're getting a little bit off track here because what I was trying to talk about was this idea that when you go into a flotation device, which is a form of wellness, in other words, it's marketed to you as something that is good for you. Of course, on a neurological level or whatever, like your anxiety levels go down, your cortisol goes down, etc. I'm not disputing this. But from a psychoanalytic principle, you're simply putting yourself in a short circuit in which you exist purely on the level of ego. In other words, you exist on the level of the imaginary. There's nothing in the symbolic order that exists to disrupt your experience of self. And so you have a tautological overlap between me and I, essentially. I am in this tank, and therefore I am. Which, for those of you who have studied philosophy, will immediately will ring bells, because we are now at the Cartesian cogito. The Cartesian cogito is famously, I mean, everybody knows this, I think. Like, you don't even have to study philosophy. Like, it's literally like in pop songs and stuff. I think, therefore I am. Right? I think, therefore I am. And what the Cartesian cogito posits is that there's a direct correlation between the thinking subject and the being of that subject. In other words, if you want to take the traditional divide between the phenomenon and the noumenon, the phenomenon is how something appears, the noumenon is how something is in itself. In other words, on the level of appearance and fantasy and illusion, we have the phenomenon. And on the level of the noumenon, we have the external reality, the Kantian das Ding an sich, etc. Within the idea of the Cartesian cogito, I think, therefore I am, there is a tautology between the phenomenon and the noumenon. I appear to myself as thinking, which represents the essence of me. The phenomenon of my thought becomes the noumenon of my being, which is wonderfully comforting and also deeply misleading. I mean, in a sense, this is again the history of all philosophy, is that everything occurs as a revolution. And so the Cartesian cogito posits this immanence between being and essence that then the rest of Western philosophy, up until the existentialist, tries to pick apart, essentially, the difference between existence and being as such. Now, the Kantian response to the I think, therefore I am, is essentially to posit, I think, therefore I am an object. Or if you want to put it differently, I think that ... In other words, that the positing of a thought, as soon as you think something, you've already externalized something into signification. I think X, which is different from I'm thinking about X. If you say I'm thinking about X, you're simply visualizing something. If you say I think X, it means that you've already posited the thought is something that happens in the world. In other words, what Kant does on a very basic level is to simply extrapolate the phenomenon from the noumenon, which is what Kant always does. Remember, the most radical thing that Kant does isn't to suggest that there is an ideal object that exists beyond the realm of human reason, or that the subject is bound by the impossibility of reason obtaining this object. The most radical thing Kant does is to say that the subject is itself conceived of as object. In other words, that as soon as you think, I think, therefore I am, you've posited that the I is an object, that the I is a phenomenon rather than a noumenon. And so Kant has this quite radical idea, which is that the self, what you experience as I, emerges only retroactively against the horizon of the impossibility of said self. And what's interesting is Kant isn't positing that the self is therefore an illusion. Kant is essentially saying that the self can only be posited as illusion. That what you experience as selfhood, since it has to be mediated by thought, which again is another word for reason, is the mediation of reason. In other words, that the I wasn't there to begin with. It wasn't I, then I had a thought, then I realized I was an I. It was thought precedes I. In other words, the most revolutionary kernel within the Kantian transcendental turn is to say that appearance, thought, phenomenon, illusion, fantasy, whatever you want to call it, comes first. And it is retroactively that the I is posited. However, we are back at the Kantian cop-out. The Kantian cop-out is that Kant says, therefore, the I isn't noumenal. Therefore, the I doesn't exist. Therefore, the I is simply another illusion. It's only with Hegel that we go to Hegel's famous aphorism, spirit equals bone, which is another way of saying substance equals subject, which is another way of saying absolute equals finite, right? The universal equals particular. It's essentially saying that the two things that were supposed to be radically opposite, which in the Cartesian cogito briefly became the same, are in fact the same. In other words, to take it a step back, if the classic Western metaphysical idea is that we have a radical separation between subject and object, between a particular subjectivity and an infinite objectivity, between the universal order and the particular order, that is traditional Western metaphysics, which itself was a response to the fact that the sophists were undermining the certainty of the world of myth. Remember, that's what I said last week, what Plato did. What Descartes does is that Descartes posits that essentially these two separate spheres are one. I think, therefore I am. Kant then says, wait a minute, I'm going to re-separate them. Kant is performing, apropos Descartes, something similar to what is happening with the idea of Plato and the world of myth. Of course, all of this isn't done in the moment. It's done retroactively in both Hegel and Lacan, etc. But the positing is Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Now we have, for Kant, the idea, I think, therefore I am object. I, the thinking self, exists on the level of the phenomenon, not on the level of the noumenon. In other words, Kant has rescued the noumenon from itself. Kant has rescued the ideal self from itself. Hegel then comes with the idea of spirit equals bone, which is essentially, again, going back to Descartes, saying, yes, they are the same, except he's not saying what Descartes said. It's not the Cartesian cogito where there's a self-transparent subject. Instead, in a very sneaky way for Hegel, the self-transparency of the subject emerges retroactively as the ultimate illusion, which creates the subject. I know this is difficult, but it's like the illusion of transparency of the subject is the only positing of the subject. In other words, there is no subject behind the curtain that could be self-transparent. It's only in the false self-transparency of the subject and the failure of that subject emerges. Now, if you want to make a radical jump here to Lacan, here's a very simple word game that will help you understand this. Remember, Freud has the idea, wo es war, soll ich werden, where it was, I will become. It being the unconscious to the conscious subject. Now, the word es in German, it, es, is exactly the same as the sign for the Lacanian subject, the letter S. The Lacanian subject, S, is simply the German it. S, it, becomes Lacanian S, subject. In other words, the subject is the subject of the unconscious. The subject of the unconscious is the subject of the symbolic order, which means that the idea of the self-transparent subject exists on the level of the imaginary, which is on the level of the ego. In other words, I know this is all a little bit difficult, the idea of subjectivity, S, emerges through the illusion of the ideal ego, the self-transparent subject, which Descartes already posited, and it is the failure of that transparency which creates the retroactive illusion of subject. Now, what is the sign that Lacan uses for said subject? It is S with a stripe through it, the barred subject. In other words, the barred subject is the subject that is only posited through the illusion of the self-transparent subject, which I know is technical, but to put that much more easily, the idea is this. Subjectivity is the process of not inhabiting the self and yet believing the self exists. That is called the barred subject. In other words, you are most yourself at the exact moment that you fail to inhabit yourself. That was a very long...
That was nicely laid out.
Well, probably you'd need as I was saying it, I was like, this is so condensed that probably we should have made it more accessible.
Well, can I back up a little bit and try and maybe re-articulate the relationship from cogito? Because I think that that's not something that we've emphasized or talked about a lot before, but I think that's a really helpful jumping off point. Because I'd always learned it as being a linear relationship. Mm-hmm. One thing happens, that which causes another thing. Mm-hmm. And putting primacy on the sort of rational aspect has led to this sort of cascading effect of prioritizing rational, empirical strains in philosophy. And what you're suggesting is that Kant looks back at it and rejects it, and Hegel rejects it as well, but Hegel doesn't really reject cogito. He just says you don't understand the consequences of what you're saying. And he, rather than treating it as a linear relationship, treats them as an equal relationship, but says you need to prioritize the being.
True, but there's another way that I would frame it, because you were actually very, very on point. Mm-hmm. So there's something that happens within the tradition of Western philosophy, which is that every revolution in Western thought emerges as an attempt to undermine the previous one. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you two examples of that. Remember, last week I said that the idea of Socrates and Platonic metaphysics, the divide between essence and appearance, is itself a response to the sophist's undermining of the world of myth. The world of myth is hermeneutically sealed. Everything happens for a reason. The sophists say everything could be made to happen for a reason. The sophists say that if you speak the word carriage, a literal carriage will come out of your mouth. Plato tries to, in a sense, restore the world of myth. But what's important here, he's not going back. In a sense, Plato is very smart because the rupture has been achieved. It would be reactionary to posit that you could just go back to the world of myth. Instead, Plato takes the damage done by the sophists. I mean, damage is like a very, loaded word. And he turns that into an entire new system. Kant does something similar apropos the rise of Western empiricists versus the Cartesian cogito. The Cartesian cogito, as you put it, announces this arrival of empiricists like Hume, etc., where the reason alone is the thing that can allow us to objectively assess the world. We have the beginning of this like very reason-centric world.
Scientific revolution. And,
exactly.
Yeah.
And Kant sees that he wants to, in a sense, restore the Cartesian revolution in its most radical form, which is the idea that you would look at the Cartesian revolution and your conclusion is that I am the ultimate authority and that reason is objective and we can study the world from this like external objective position. The idea that Kant and Hegel allow is to go back to Descartes and to essentially say, wait, something much more radical is happening here. Because if the subject is self-transparent, then that also means that essence doesn't really exist except through the self-transparency of the subject. In other words, what you thought was a priori is in a sense no longer there. That's the radical consequence, which the Western empiricists, of course, lose. Now, if we go all the way to Lacan, through radicalizing Freudian psychoanalysis, does something similar. He is essentially saying, let's not go against Descartes, let's rescue Descartes from himself. Let's go back to this idea. Which is also why it's really interesting that Lacan never thought of himself as a philosopher, and yet his entire edifice is about going back to philosophical paradigms and discussions. And of course, the reason that happens in Lacan, the reason we have this paradox in Lacan, is because Lacan understands perfectly well the impossibility of the idea of the philosophical master. In other words, the person who posits himself as the ultimate arbiter of wisdom and knowledge, which Lacan knows is a necessary fake for the other to, in a sense, have the short circuit of hysterical othering. And so what happens within Lacan is much more like Diogenes here. Because remember, Diogenes has this thing where he says like, oh, if everything can be thought and everything can be a concept, like Diogenes is responding to the idea, like the Zeno's paradoxes, etc., that motion can't exist. Mm-hmm. And Diogenes is like, well, if motion can't exist, then why the fuck can I just get up and walk away? But here's what's crucial about this passage, right? Because we're all like, Diogenes. One of Diogenes' students goes, you're so clever. And Diogenes turns around and slaps his student. Because that, for Diogenes, is the problem. The problem isn't, I can prove you wrong, or I can do this thing. The problem is the external observer who thinks that I am so smart that I've proved everybody wrong. Mm-hmm. The student is the problem. That's what Diogenes isn't trying to disprove the non-existence of movement. He's trying to prove the non-existence of people's critical faculty to live that kind of reason itself. And so Lacan is like Diogenes in this sense, which is that Lacan is very much going back to philosophical principles, but at the exact point that you say, oh, Lacan is a philosopher, he wants to slap you around. No, how can you still believe? Because what he's saying is, how can you still believe in the idea of a philosopher after everything that has happened through the transcendental turn? Because remember, the philosopher still posits the fundamental fantasy that there is this ideal substance, this transcendental reality that can be reached. And so what's funny, what happens is that to practice philosophy becomes a form of anti-philosophy, which is that you have to be the person who disrupts the perceived unity of this binary essence versus appearance. Mm-hmm. I want to end on something much more simple though, right? Because this got a lot more difficult than I wanted it to be, and I apologize, but I hope it's also valuable. I want to talk about a cat. So I was talking to somebody this week, a friend of ours, who has a cat. And this cat has like the most perfect example and illustration for me of the idea of the symbolic order, which is that when this person met his cat, the cat was astray, and the cat was limping. Do you know the story? The cat was limping. And he thought, well, I'm worried that the cat is limping. I'm going to take the cat to the vet, see what's wrong. And after a couple of consultations, the vet goes to the man, our friend, and says, there's nothing wrong with your cat. Your cat only limps when he knows you're watching. In other words, your cat knows that you pity him because he's limping, and therefore you will take care of him. In other words, the cat is the master. Your cat is your master because your cat has convinced you that he is weak and in need of care. And of course, everybody who owns a cat knows that to have a cat is to become the slave of the cat. And what's beautiful about any relationship with a cat is it's the perfect example of the Hegelian dialectical mediation between the slave and the bondsman, which is another version of the vanishing mediator. Within the idea of the slave and the master, the slave and the bondsman, the idea is that the master is the one who's supposed to be indifferent. But of course, the master's mastery only emerges precisely by being indifferent to the world of the slave. In other words, a cat is only a master to the extent that the cat is also like not fully inhabiting your world. Like if your cat suddenly had to have a job and drive a car and get gas and put food on the table, the cat wouldn't be the master. And it's precisely in this radical indifference that the cat emerges as master. But it also means that the slave, i.e. you, the slave to the cat, is the person who inhabits existence more properly. And that's the paradox that happens with the master-slave relationship. It's precisely the slave who is bound to the world, who then becomes the person who is in the world. But of course, retroactively, the cat emerges as master because you as a human being in the world imagine the cat as the person who is ultimately detached. And so we have a closing of an open circle here, which is that the cat retroactively emerges as master figure because the cat is exempt of your conditions of existence, which means that you are the one who has to preserve the cat. I'm not being very elegant here. This is not scripted out. But what I think is so beautiful about this example is the idea that the cat is performing a limp for the gaze of the other. And the key observation within Lacanian psychoanalysis and the Bard's subject is that this limp that you perform for the other is a limp that is real. It's a real limp. It's not just staged. It's a real limp that you experience. In other words, the incapability of fully inhabiting your true self is your true self. It's not, oh, I'm putting on a mask to pretend to the world that I am this. There is nothing underneath the mask. And here we go back to the idea of Kant. Remember, up until the transcendental turn, the idea is that within the world of appearances, behind the world of appearances, there is an essence, a pure truth, an ideal form. It's only within the Lacanian turn on the cogito that Lacan then posits that there is nothing behind the world of appearances. There is nothing underneath the mask except the mask. The mask is the truth. In the same way that the cat who is limping, it's not just that the cat is performing sickness to mask its health. Its very health is the performance of sickness. In other words, in a Kierkegaardian sense, life and existence is the sickness unto death. Now, this is also where we have to complete the class by completing the triad between Cartesian cogito, Kantian cogito, and Lacanian cogito, which is subjectivity. For Descartes, I think, therefore I am. For Kant, I think, therefore I am object. For Lacan, I am where I don't think, and I think where I am not. In other words, thought isn't the expression of an original self, of an a priori essence of subjectivity. Thought is what emerges retroactively when you're confronted with the radical void of subjectivity. Now, what's so important here is that when you link up these three, the Cartesian, the Kantian, and the Lacanian, suddenly you realize that what emerges as subjectivity is the crack between essence and appearance itself. In other words, that subjectivity isn't just the thing that lies in between the ideal form of essence and the phenomenological world of appearance. Instead, subjectivity is the very thing that provides the catalyst for the appearance of essence and appearance itself. In other words, that subjectivity is a vanishing mediator. And it's precisely through the lived experience of becoming a vanishing mediator that essence and appearance emerge. And so within the Lacanian framework, we go essentially from the Descartesian Cartesian idea that there is an essence which I can fully inhabit, a self-transparent self, towards the Kantian idea that to be self-transparent is to become object. And then the Lacanian idea, which is a properly Hegelian idea, which is finally that the illusion of transparency is what retroactively generates object and subject in the first place. In other words, that when you experience a self and a subjectivity is a vanishing mediator for the passage from essence to appearance back into essence itself. In other words, we have a chiasmic structure where we go from a non-posited essence towards a world of appearance in which emerges the X of subjectivity, which creates retroactively the Kantian idea of subject as objective experience, which then finally culminates in the idea of essence. Which means that in technical terms, Lacan has saved the idea of essence from itself. Lacan has saved the idea of the Cartesian subject from itself. And so what's really important to note here is that every revolution in Western philosophical, even psychoanalytic thought, makes the necessary conclusion that the previous generation couldn't see in order to preserve the original content of that. I feel like I've made this way too hard.
No.
I wish that we could do a much more fun here's some jokes, etc.
Guess what's gonna happen next week?
What's happening next week?
There's gonna be another class.
That's good. I know. I feel like I made this too hard. I apologize. But
no, I don't think so. There's a lot to think about.
Yeah,
and it's a good framework. Yeah.
If you unpack this and you go over it with some notes, then you're going to be able to see how what I'm trying to say is linking up. But I don't want you to have to do that much work because I'm probably not worth it. But this is it, essentially. This is part of it. Now, of course, everything that I've said here and in the past 9 weeks, will be appearing as a book called The Vanishing Mediator, which you can download as an ebook in February. So if this is a lot to unpack, fret not. 3 weeks from now, 4 weeks from now, you will be able to read this in a much more simple form. On that note, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And we're actually going to be hosting a live bonus discussion on Discord where we can unpack some of these ideas. That's going to start in 5 minutes. It's going to start on Discord. If you'd like to join us, simply become a patron, and all of our patrons can join us. So thank you so much for watching, and thank you, Jenny.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And we shall see you guys on the Discord in 5 minutes.
Have a great week, everyone.
Thanks, guys.